Hi, I'm Tom Wadsworth, and this is an attempt to redo part one of my 7-part series on worship, how we got worship wrong, that is, an overall look at the Christian assembly as seen in the New Testament. I'm redoing part one because the original version, which was done before a live audience in 2022, had some audio glitches. It's still tolerable to listen to, but I've had several requests to redo it, and so here's my best shot at redoing episode 1 of The Assembly, How We Got Worship Wrong. This has 7 different episodes, as you'll see on the other episodes that are now available on YouTube. I won't repeat their titles here right now, but you can see them on the screen, and you can also see them on YouTube. I first want to point out what this presentation is not. This is not an attempt to defend any particular denomination's view of what the assembly should look like, nor is it an attempt to attack anybody's particular view of what the assembly is about. What this is, however, is my best attempt after over 45 years of studying this topic to explain and to identify what is going on in the New Testament with regard to Christian assemblies. Why did they meet? What did they do when they met? What did they call those things they did when they met? And in an effort to get a better understanding and a clearer understanding of first century perception of what the assembly, the Christian assembly, was all about. There's some things that have happened in the last few years that have brought more attention, I think, to the assembly. The pandemic was one of the factors that really brought our attention to it. There was this, as you see on the screen, this image from Time magazine, what we learned from the pandemic. And I think we learned a lot by having our schedules dramatically altered, both for work and for church, as well as for what we did on our own time. In terms of what happened in church, as you may remember, churches were shut down. Not only all over the United States, but all over the world, in various places and in most places, probably, where churches were not allowed to meet for several months or weeks or months, depending on the denomination and their attitude toward the whole thing. But when they did meet, they were spread apart, as you see in this image here on the screen. People were supposed to be 6 feet away from each other. And in general, fewer people started to come and more people were streaming it online, like in this particular image from the Associated Press out of Brentwood, Tennessee, where you would only have the pastor show up. He'd get behind the pulpit and the only other person in the audience would be the tech guy there in the back. And they would then stream the sermon and anything else that they did for a watching audience watching online back at home. Well, this raised several questions, I think. What are we doing when we get together? And maybe why are we doing it? I think these are important questions we need to ask. And I think another question that came up, if we're only going to stream certain parts of the assembly, what are the essential parts that we need to show to everybody? And what are the non-essential parts? There was another Christianity Today title of an article that said, what we lose when we live stream. Well, several questions were begged by this whole experience of the pandemic and how we do our Christian assemblies. And what this attempt is in this particular presentation is not the result of some research I did since the pandemic. It's actually a result of some research that came a long time ago that I stumbled onto in 1977. And we're going to show the 7 episodes that I just talked about earlier. This one is about why the early church didn't have worship services. Or next week, we'll talk about the real meaning of worship in the Bible. We'll go on to talk about the temple, why they didn't preach sermons in church. We'll talk about the role of music in the assembly, as well as episode number 6, which is probably my most important episode here. It's a discussion of why and how the church later developed its concept of worship services. I encourage you not to miss episode number 6. And then we'll wrap it up with episode number 7, which is the biblical purpose of going to church, and several of my own recommendations as to how we can adapt our current assemblies to mirror more like what they were doing in the New Testament, if that's something you indeed want to do. But first, episode number 1, why the early church didn't have worship services. They didn't, you might ask. Well, turns out they didn't in the same sense that we would talk about that. Now, let me explain where I'm coming from. I first stumbled onto this idea back in 1977. I was in my first year of preaching as a pulpit minister. And October the 30th of 1977, I came to chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. I'd been preaching through the entire book of 1 Corinthians, taking one chapter at a time. I was now into my 14th week, and I was faced with chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. Now, this chapter presented some challenges for me because at that time, as some of you may recall back in the late 70s, the practice of speaking in tongues was starting to spread to different churches, not just charismatic or Pentecostal churches as they might be called today. And the practice of speaking in tongues was deemed to be very controversial. And this chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, deals specifically with the issue of speaking in tongues. So I was tempted actually to skip over this chapter, knowing that it might be problematic. But I thought, surely there must be something in this chapter that's worth recapturing for a modern audience today. And as I dug closer into the text, the Greek text of 1 Corinthians 14, I began to see some things that were actually astonishingly applicable to today. And without going into great detail about what 1 Corinthians 14 says, let's go right to the summary or the key statement that Paul comes to in verse 26. After going through this lengthy discussion about what people are supposed to do when they come together in an assembly of Christians, he says, what's the outcome then, brothers and sisters? When you assemble. Each one has a psalm, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. And then the key verse is, or the key statement is this last one in verse 26. All things are to be done for edification, which is another word for building up one another. All things, he says. And this statement is in command form where you can't miss it. He definitely wants people to get this statement, probably more than anything else. All things are to be done for edification. But as I studied this passage, this lengthy passage that talks about Christian assemblies, I was stunned with the absence of the word worship in here. I thought, up to that point in my life, that the assembly was for worship. After all, we have hours of worship, don't we? We have a house of worship that we go to. We open worship with prayer, and then we close worship with maybe a benediction or another prayer or something, maybe a song. We ask people, where do you worship? We talk about orders of worship. We sometimes hire a worship leader or a worship pastor for the worship team, and we have worship services. We call these acts of worship that we do on our Sundays or Saturdays. And we also talk about what constitutes acceptable worship. And some churches or denominations won't allow certain things because it's not acceptable worship. Well, the question hit me was, where does all that language come from? If it doesn't come from the Bible, where is it coming from? And for that sermon on October the 30th of 1977, I looked up every time the word worship is found in the Old and New Testaments to try to figure out what is this word and what might it not be applied to the Christian assembly. Now, I know some questions you're asking right now, but stay with me and you'll see these questions eventually answered. But there's a big difference between our terminology and biblical terminology. We talk about going to worship and house of worship and all those things I just mentioned. But in the first century, they talked about coming together, not going to worship, but coming together. They didn't have a house of worship. They had a house church. They had a home where they met for their assemblies. They didn't talk about worship services. They talked about their gatherings, their assemblies. What they gathered for was to break bread or to build up one another. They had elders and teachers who mostly presided over what went on in those first century assemblies. They had activities that edify, that build up people, whereas we have acts of worship in our assemblies. And Paul's command was, let all things be done for edification, whereas today we might say all things must be done for the worship of God. As I've often heard it said that the assembly is all about God, because it's not about can't all be all about us. Because if it's all about us, it ain't about much. I don't know if you've heard that statement before. Well, what if God says, no, wait a minute, people. The assembly is all about you getting better, about forming unity with one another, about improving your Christian graces and traits and qualities. Let's listen to what God says instead of what we've been saying about the assembly. I think that's where I'm going with this. Throughout all this study, I came up with a term that I describe now as the worship anomaly, which could be summarized as this. The New Testament does not use worship terminology to refer to the Christian assembly or to its services. Really. And this is an anomaly. It's this strange, odd fact that applies to the biblical teaching on this topic. Worship terminology is not used to describe the Christian assembly or its activities. My investigation actually got into this very deeply, which involved a PhD dissertation. After studying this thing for 40-some years, in 2016, I entered a PhD program in New Testament at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. And throughout my entire time there, I was focusing on this topic in all the different classes and papers that I wrote. The topic of worship and what it means or doesn't mean for the first century Christian assembly. And so in my investigation and my dissertation, the first thing I had to do, study what scholars were saying about worship and about the first century assemblies. I also then analyzed key New Testament passages that talked about the assembly. And in my effort to understand what worship was in the New Testament, I had to analyze the Greek words that were translated as worship. Because it's not so important to figure out what the English word means. It's more important to understand what the Greek word means. And those Greek words are, you see them on your screen, proskuneo, latruo, latergeo, the sebo word group of sebomai and eusebeo and things like that, as well as threskeia is another one of the words that is sometimes translated as worship. You might be asking, well, if you studied a whole bunch of scholars on this topic, hasn't anybody else noticed this strange oddity, this worship anomaly before? Surely it can't be that some guy in the 20th century stumbled on this in 1977 and nobody has seen this before? Well, as it turns out, several scholars have spotted this oddity, this worship anomaly before since 1952, which is the first time I could actually find a reference to this thing. But let's talk about what scholars found and what they were saying. The first scholar that I could find on this topic was Gerhard Delling, who was a German scholar writing Worship in the New Testament, a book that he wrote in 1952, published later by Westminster Press. It's first published in German, later translated into English because it was a powerful book. He comes to this statement: primitive Christianity, in marked difference from the religion of its Greek environment, attached no importance to the external framework of its worship. We hear nothing of the use of visible symbols, nothing at all about arranging the room, etc., and that cannot be a matter of chance. You can imagine Delling coming at this topic from being typically in a Lutheran assembly. He was looking for all the furniture, all the external framework of the church's worship, as he called it, the way the room is arranged, the symbols and all that. Nothing is mentioned about that in the New Testament. And he says that can't be just a matter of chance. There must have been some reason behind it. Turns out he was right. He didn't actually get to figure that out himself, but others have picked up on that where he left off. Another scholar was another Lutheran scholar in 1952, writing again, a German scholar, Peter Brunner, writing in his book, Worship in the Name of Jesus. He said this amazing statement: the New Testament does not permit us simply to use the word worship to designate the subject of our investigation. Even though scholars for a long time, when they talk about how Christians met together in the first century and what they did when they got together, they've typically always called that worship. But he says the New Testament doesn't permit us to use the word worship to discuss the subject of this investigation. And nonetheless, he still titled his book Worship in the Name of Jesus when it was translated into English in 1968. But he also stumbled on this worship anomaly, but did not actually fully investigate it out as to why it is the case. Edward Schweitzer is a Swiss scholar writing a few years later in 1959. He made this statement when he studied this topic in the New Testament. He says, it's very significant that nowhere in the New Testament the usual terms of the cult, that is, sacrifice, offering, even worship, are applied to the assembling of the church for its services. A stunning observation by a top-flight New Testament scholar in 1959. He also didn't have too much opportunity to flesh that out. Bo Reike, another German scholar reflecting on this topic also in 1959, he came to this question as he studied this topic. He said, doesn't worship have any importance for the New Testament authors? He was stunned with the fact that the way they deal with it is so different than the way we deal with it. He wondered if the New Testament authors like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter, James, and John, everybody else, doesn't it have any importance for these people? A shocking realization. He came to other interesting statements, but let's use just that one just to whet your appetite. A little bit later on, a guy named Franklin Young, another New Testament scholar from the United States. This is the first time that American scholars chimed in on this worship anomaly issue. He wrote in 1963 in a book published by Oxford University Press, Christians had nothing to do that could be called worship in the cultic sense. Now, this is like dropping a bomb in the middle of a culture that doesn't do anything but call what we do on Sundays as worship. But there's other people too. Let's continue on. In 1975, a Church of Christ scholar, Irvin Bishop, who was actually a translator from Greek into English, when he was in Greece, he stumbled on some interesting observations as he went into the New Testament to flesh it out. He said the concept of the assembly as a worship service, as we speak of it today, is completely foreign to the New Testament. Whoa, completely foreign to the New Testament? And my own study of this topic has actually made me agree with what Irvin Bishop was saying. Let's look also a little bit later. In 1980, Robert Banks, who has an interesting past himself, he was an Anglican priest studying New Testament at Cambridge University, which was probably the top flight New Testament seminary in the world at that time. He studied this topic, and he said in his 1980 book, Paul never said that a person went to church primarily to worship. Not once in all his writings does he suggest that this is the case. Remarkable statement. Banks was so persuaded by this difference of what he saw in the New Testament as to what he experienced in his normal church experience, that he essentially left the Anglican priesthood, went to Australia, and started an entire network of house churches, which exists even to this day. And he still writes about this topic in some scholarly writings and books even now. He's in his 80s, probably not much longer to go, but he's still writing prolifically on this topic. Let's go on a little bit later on. I. Howard Marshall, In 1985, wrote what is perhaps the most significant and the most succinct summary of this worship anomaly issue in an article he wrote in the Churchman Scholarly Journal at that time. The article was titled, this strange title, "How Far Did the Early Christians Worship God?" How far? Well, he explains this odd title, and he comes to this conclusion. Worship is not an umbrella term for what goes on when Christians gather together. That's just one of a host of statements he makes in this article, when he realizes that when we call it worship, we don't have it right. We've got our heads in the wrong place. If you can find this article, or if you'd write me, I'll send you a copy of it. You'd find this article very, very interesting. And I. Howard Marshall, by the way, was highly regarded among evangelical scholars. He was the dean of evangelical Christendom, you might say, back for a long time. He was the editor of Evangelical Quarterly for about 25 years toward the end of the last century. He died just now several years ago, but has continued to be an icon of evangelical scholarship, even to this day. A little bit later on, in 1992, David Peterson, another, he now lives in Australia, wrote the book Engaging with God, which was his biblical theology of worship. He made this statement: contemporary Christians obscure the Bible's teaching on this subject when they apply worship to what goes on in Sunday services. Something's wrong with the way we talk about it. And then John Richardson, who is another Anglican priest who wrote on this topic 10 years after Howard Marshall's article. He wrote it in the same publication, Churchman magazine, journal, in 1995. He was stunned that more people weren't reacting strongly to what Howard Marshall had said in following what he said, because it was so shocking and life-altering, but nobody was following it. But he says in his article, there is no such thing as worship, at least not as we know it. And Richardson made several blunt statements like that, which I think I agree with what he's saying. Interesting. A little bit later on, Streeter Stewart, who wrote in Howard Marshall's Evangelical Quarterly this article on New Testament perspective of worship, he concluded that worship was not associated with particular acts or practices done at particular locations as we are accustomed to think of worship. A shocking statement from another scholar on this very topic in 1996. Everett Ferguson, who is another Church of Christ scholar who's known worldwide as probably the foremost expert in early Christianity, also faced this strange anomaly, the worship anomaly, in his book on the Church of Christ, talking about what they did in the first century. And as he faced this problem with the word worship, he said it really would be better to speak of assembly as what they did when they got together, or some such word to describe these congregational gatherings of Christians. I agree with that statement. Worship is not the right word to use. We need to think of some other word. And assembly is definitely a biblical word that was applied to that thing, that gathering of Christians. And as I studied through actually dozens of scholars and books and articles that they had written over the last 100 years, I came across this gap of people who weren't reflecting on this worship anomaly. And it happens starting around 1996, and there's this surprising silence on this topic. And I attribute this to the explosion of so-called worship music that took place around then. This is when worship wars began to be fought in all kinds of denominations around the world. Even praise and worship music became a billion-dollar industry, and worship pastors were being hired, and worship music was all the rage. And I could go on and on about this. See episode 5 on the role of music, and you'll see more on this particular topic. But people, I think what was going on there as to the reason why nobody was reflecting on the worship anomaly is because this pervasive, extensive use of worship terminology flooding our churches and flooding the Christian media at that time, both in writings as well as in video, as in music, drowned out the New Testament perspective of what an assembly is all about. But finally, in 2014, Andrew McGowan returns in his book. By the way, he's a Yale New Testament scholar, an Anglican priest, as I recall, who wrote in his book on ancient Christian worship, studying the first few centuries of how Christians did their gatherings back then. And at the beginning of his book, he says this statement: "We must admit something difficult at the outset. In the ancient world, what we now call worship did not quite exist." Now, even though that's true, he still called his book Ancient Christian Worship, because he knew that that's a hot topic that people will pick up and buy that book. And it's a great book, by the way. It's really some helpful stuff in there. But I think he uses this word wrong, and it leads to some wrong understandings, which is what this 7-part series of videos that I'm presenting here is all about. But as I summarized all the writers and scholars reflecting on this topic, I noticed that they all used some shocking adjectives as they studied the worship anomaly. They called it things like striking, surprising, astonishing, startling, remarkable, significant, strange, puzzling, and difficult. They knew that this oddity, that worship terminology, is not used to refer to Christian assemblies in the New Testament, is indeed startling and difficult. Sort of the purpose of my dissertation was to try to figure out what's going on in the New Testament, to answer the question of why the New Testament does not use worship terminology in reference to Christian gatherings. Now, this task we have today is a difficult one, and I liken it to the church is now buried under centuries of dirt and of built-up traditional understanding of what we're doing when we get together. And we have our work cut out for us to try to dig our way out of this mess and to back into the light of Scripture to try to find out what's really going on in the New Testament with regard to the assembly. And that's what these 7 videos are all about. As I went through my research for my dissertation on this, I came to 2 surprising bonus findings, I could call them. One is about liturgy. Now, if you don't know what liturgy is, it could be defined as the use of rote or recited, repeated things going on in every assembly that a church does. This is liturgy. Some churches use lots of liturgy, and they're typically called high church. Churches have a little amount of liturgy, or almost none, would be called low church assemblies. Regardless of what their perspective is, these messages are for everybody here, because I think we all have to learn something from the New Testament on this topic. But Paul Bradshaw, who himself is a liturgical scholar who studies these issues of liturgy in the New Testament and beyond, he wrote in 2002 in a book published by Oxford University Press, he made the point that liturgical scholars are now acknowledging that the common assumption that the New Testament is filled with references to Christian liturgy is, quote, more like wishful thinking or the unconscious projections back into ancient times of later practices. In other words, since churches later on, and even many churches today, routinely have liturgical practices in their assembly, they just naturally assume that those practices are back there in the first century. But here's even a liturgical scholar who came to the realization that this is just wishful thinking, or it's really anachronism, taking later practices and trying to jam those into the first century. So that was bonus finding number 1 on the topic of liturgy. And then there was a bonus finding number 2 that related to the topic of the study of synagogues in the New Testament, or in the Jewish world in the first few centuries. And this is a realization that synagogue scholars are now realizing that first century synagogues and their activities were not described as worship. Now, you'll see books and articles and scholars today talk about synagogue worship in the first century. Well, as it turns out, Jews did not refer to what they did in the synagogue as worship. Now, what they did in the temple was indeed worship, but this synagogue stuff, that wasn't worship. And my research into first century assemblies remarkably lines up well with others' research into first century synagogues. There will be more to say about that, and we'll touch on that in a few points later on in this series. So my studied scholars and their assessment of the anomaly. I also then studied key New Testament passages about the assembly, and there were 15 such passages that are listed now on your screen. I tried to find any reference, any detailed reference to what Christians did when they got together, and studied those in depth to see what's going on. Is there worship terminology in there? And in generally, why did they meet? And if I had to summarize a result of that entire study of all those passages, which took me years to do, there were only 2 passages that used worship language while they were talking about the assembly. But in both cases, the term did not refer to congregational activity as we would understand worship. It's surprising. I could get into those 2, and I'll talk about those 2 at a later time. And also another result of this study of these 15 passages in the New Testament, most of the congregational activities could have been described as horizontal activities, not as vertical. But most of them were things like you're teaching one another, you're exhorting one another. And this horizontalness, this one another activity could be described as horizontal. There's encouraging and strengthening one another, edifying one another. All these horizontal activities were very common and were the dominant activities going on in these assemblies. There were a few activities that were certainly vertical, such as praying and singing as we understand them. They are activities that you address to God. But typically we apply everything we're doing in our assembly as a vertical activity to God. After all these are acts of worship in our worship services done during our hour of worship in our house of worship led by our worship pastor. And you get the idea. But as it turns out, most of the activities in the New Testament were horizontal activities. And another result that I came to as a result of this study of New Testament assemblies and all these passages in the New Testament, there is one passage that was the most significant, and that's 1 Corinthians chapter 14, that chapter that hit me between the eyes like a ton of bricks in 1977. It's key because that passage and that passage alone focuses on what Christians do when they get together, why they do it, what they should not be doing when they get together, and what they should be doing. It's immensely important, and in my lifetime, I've heard almost no one ever preach on this topic or speak about it. It's quite amazing. So I also studied the Greek words that are translated as worship. In a way, I didn't really need to study these words because it's our focus and our infatuation with the idea of worship that we want to study what worship is. But I figured I needed to understand what the Greek words meant when they are used in the New Testament. So I looked in depth into these 5 different Greek words that I mentioned earlier as to what they mean. And the result of that study, if I had to summarize it really quickly, it's really questionable whether any of those 5 words should be translated as worship. I found that all 5 of these words, none of them are synonymous. All of them refer to different things, distinctly different things, and none of them, I think, should be translated with this English word worship. We have come to use that word in a different sense than the way they used it in the first century, and it leads to a markedly different understanding of what we do when we get together. Another result of that study of all these worship words, that again took me months and years to do, years really is correct. All 5 words refer to various aspects of temple activities, both in the Jewish world as well as in the pagan world. Because it wasn't just Jews that had a temple and had temple worship. Pagans also had temples and had temple worship as well. And in episode number 2, we'll get into all the details of what all those words mean. But a third result, which is maybe a critically important one about this study of worship words in the New Testament, the sacrificial death of Jesus nullified the need for a temple and its activities. He predicted its absolute destruction, which we'll talk about in episode number 3. Don't miss that one. That's very interesting. And if temple worship goes away, what is, I think, a necessary conclusion, so also worship went away, in the sense that the New Testament means those Greek words that are so translated. Now, as we get into this topic, there are several barriers to understanding what I'm saying. One of the obvious barriers is this is so odd and so different and so countercultural to our common understanding of what we do when we get together. We're just not going to be able to wrap our heads around it. It took me decades to wrap my heads around it, and I'm trying to help you adapt to this New Testament idea of what this is in just a few minutes or a few hours of my video series. So bear with me. But there are some other barriers that really hurt us in this. One is simply terminology. And I find when we use the word worship to refer to what Christians did when they gathered together, that already is going to be a problem, because that's not the word that they would have used to describe it. And generally, the problem here is using non-biblical terminology to refer to biblical things. And this is an understanding that's been well known in hermeneutics, in the study of translating and interpreting the New Testament for a long time. If you use a non-biblical term to refer to a biblical thing, you're going to already, from the get-go, be on a false foundation for all future discussions that take place after that. Terminology. Anachronism is a big one here. I didn't realize that when I went into my PhD dissertation, but it didn't take long after wading through all this scholarly work to realize that anachronism is a problem. What is anachronism, you say? Good question. We don't use that word a lot. But it is the error of reading modern concepts back into an ancient era, or in this specific case, reading modern church concepts back into the New Testament text. A huge mistake. Several scholars have written about this problem of anachronism. Don Carson, who is a well-known evangelical scholar, said, "We unwittingly read our ideas and experiences of worship back into Scripture so that we end up finding there what with exquisite confidence we jolly well knew ought to be there." I think what's going on here is we become very attached to what we do in our worship services, as we call them. We have this perception that this is a critically important thing that we're doing for God, and it must be done correctly. And so nobody wants to think that they're doing it incorrectly, and so we just automatically assume that we're doing it the way they did it in the New Testament. And this is anachronism when we get to studying the New Testament. There was another scholar who made a similar statement about this, David Owen, who writes the Anchor Bible Dictionary entry on New Testament worship back in 1992. He said that scholars have shown, quote, a marked tendency to read early fragmentary evidence anachronistically in light of later, more detailed accounts of Christian liturgical practices. He's saying that even scholars have the problem of anachronism as they study the first century assemblies and understanding what worship was back then. So if scholars have a problem with it, certainly us regular folk are going to have a problem with it as well. There's another barrier to understanding that goes along with this, and that is something that I found called pan-liturgism. What is pan-liturgism, you say? Well, it's a word that was coined in 1959, and it refers to the error of finding liturgy in the New Testament even though it isn't really there. And there are some scholars that began to realize this in 1959. Back in the 1950s, there was a major emphasis on finding liturgy in the New Testament. References to these rote, repetitive, recited things that they assumed was going on in the first century, but it turns out they're not there. This is just an assumption. This is anachronism, really. We're assuming that this liturgy that we do today was actually there in the first century, and it isn't there, even according to Paul Bradshaw, who is a top-flight liturgical scholar on this issue. Sacralism is another barrier to understanding what's going on here. Any religious person tends to be guilty of sacralism. We tend to turn things into holy things if they're associated with our religion. We make them sacred, even more sacred than the New Testament would make them. And I think we have done that regarding the activities of an assembly. We have come to view them as holy or sacred, and you cannot mess with these things because they are sacred. Well, they're only sacred if God says they're sacred. And if God says they are sacred in the New Testament or in the Old Testament, then they're definitely sacred. But now we've found what men do is people make things sacred beyond what they should be doing. And there's also a problem of definitions here. And you're probably already thinking, well, how are you defining worship here? Well, as it turns out, after I've studied this issue and been aware of this defining issue for decades, defining the English word worship accomplishes nothing. It's not productive. And I found that different scholars define it in different ways, and they're usually defining it in a way that suits their own theological purposes. So define it any way you want. I don't care how you define it. That's fine. Just knock yourself out. But it doesn't really apply to this task of trying to figure out what they did in the New Testament in their Christian assemblies. And if they didn't call it worship, then maybe we shouldn't either. Let's just call it what they called it. And it turns out that really a study of worship isn't really all that important. But it does yield some amazing, striking findings that we'll get into next week when we talk about the worship word. So stay with us on that. But one key that is an aid to understanding and getting our heads around what's going on in the New Testament is the idea of house churches. House churches were mentioned 5 different times in the New Testament. We know, for example, that they definitely met in people's homes back then, as they're mentioned in Romans and Corinthians and Colossians and Philemon and in 2 John as well. We know that Christians met in homes. They did not have sacred structures that they called churches. Even the word church today is used wrongly in that sense. It really refers to an assembly in the New Testament. It does not refer to a physical building as it does even to this day. But they met in homes. And if we want to understand what they're doing when they met in homes, it's important to think of a gathering in somebody's home, like this image I found on the internet. I thought this was very interesting. It's just somebody's artistic depiction of probably what they're doing in their first century assemblies. You see men and women and children gathering around in somebody's living room, sitting down on the couch, maybe standing up against the wall, maybe sitting on the floor, or wherever you can find a seat. And if you want to understand what they're doing in the first century, put yourself in that environment where people are dressed as they want, dressed as normal people, going over to somebody's house for a visit and sitting around in comfortable settings and just talking. Our modern day concepts of this big ceremonial, lavish, liturgy-filled gathering with somebody wearing special clothing and swinging incense or doing something. Would they do that in a home in the first century? Well, that's a question I think needs to be asked. And if we want to set our minds in the proper environment for understanding what's going on in the New Testament, try this. I think it's a key aid to understanding what's happening in the first century. So let's come down to a conclusion here. Why didn't the early church have worship services? Well, first off, they didn't perceive of their meetings as worship. There's no evidence that they did in the entire New Testament. They also didn't perceive of their meetings as services. Now, we perceive of them. We call it, what, did you go to the early service or did you go to the late service today? Well, why did we call it a service? Everybody calls it a service. But is it a service to God or is it a service to people? Well, more than likely, we probably think it's a service to God. After all, it is a worship service, and it is in the house of God and the house of worship with acts of worship. So it must be something that serves God in some way. But is this what God wants? Is this the Christian understanding of what an assembly should be all about? So they didn't perceive their meetings as worship or as services, and they also saw their meetings as gatherings. And the Greek words that are commonly applied to when they get together are simply this: they got together, they gathered, they assembled. They didn't go to worship. They didn't worship here and then worship someplace next week. But they saw their meetings as simple gatherings, not as these formal ceremonial events. This is another conclusion that I came to. And Paul actually demanded that all assembly activities focus on, he doesn't say worship, he says building up one another, which is primarily a horizontal focus, edification. It's not a vertical focus, which worship would be. Let's summarize this maybe in a little different way, comparing the Bible's approach to our approach. The Bible focuses on edification in their meetings. We focus on worship for our meetings. The Bible focuses on one another, the people in the gatherings, and helping one another, encouraging one another, praying for one another, helping one another in various ways. But our focus is not on one another. Our focus is on the minister who's up at the front, who's conducting the entire thing in the proper way because he's the only one, who has the authority to do this. Where do we get this idea? But that is our focus. The New Testament focus is on horizontal activities and some vertical activities. But in our understanding, we focus on the vertical because there's worship services and acts of worship, etc. The focus in the Bible is on the body of believers when we get together, what's going on with each other. But the focus now is more on the building. Here's another way to separate this worship model of an understanding of what you do when you get together versus the edification model. The worship model that we have today is one where the building is holy. You ever heard the song Tiptoe, Tiptoe in God's House? I remember that being sung to my kids when they were young. You're supposed to be quiet and reverent and such. But the building becomes holy if indeed we're meeting in a house of worship, a house of God, where we somehow perceive that God is more present than he is somewhere else. So the building becomes holy. The service, therefore, must be beautiful. And the worshipers, consequently, must be reverent as they gather together, often dressed in their Sunday best, of course. That's the worship model, taken to its extreme, and it's what's being done by most churches to this day. But the edification model, I find, would be a rather different approach to things. The building becomes purely functional. The building is unimportant to the gathering. What's important to the gathering is one another, and the meeting, therefore, must be edifying. That's a biblical understanding of why you're meeting and what you should be doing when you get together. You being edified and you edifying somebody else as well. And the people, as a consequence of this edification model, are constantly maturing. They're getting better. Because imagine if every week of your life, when you got together with your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, your understanding of the reason that you're there is to build up one another, to get better than you were last week, to become more patient, more kind, more compassionate, more generous, more understanding. I think if that were the focus, every week and everybody was buying into that mission of what we're doing every week when we get together, I think we would be different people after gathering together for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, like in my case, or more in many cases. But yet, if we have a worship model and we meet together to worship God every week, do we come out changed people? My observation after going to church for actually 70 years is, no, people can end up being the same scoundrels they were 50 years ago, even though they've been going to church all those years. So we have 7 episodes in this series. Tonight was on why the early church didn't have worship services. Next week, we'll talk about the real meaning of worship in the Bible, and I encourage you to be there for that. That episode is already posted on YouTube, and you can see that here on my YouTube page. This is a discussion of the assembly and how we got worship wrong. I'm Tom Wadsworth. Thanks for listening. Glad to see everybody here again. How many of you here for the first time tonight? You missed last week? There's a handful of you, yes. So glad you came, and glad that the rain didn't scare too many people away this evening. This one this evening is going to get deep into Greek, and there's just no other way to avoid it. So I'm going to need your patience, and I'm going to try to do my best to make this semi-entertaining as much as you can with a tough topic like this. This is, of course, our overall topic. We're talking about how we got worship wrong. We talked about that last week, and there's a little bit of a scope of where we're going to be dealing with the next 7 weeks. We'll talk about that at the end of this, just to remind you where we're going after this. Last week, though, when we recapped what we talked about, the reason that they didn't call going to church a worship service back in the first century was they first of all didn't describe them as worship, which is a mind-boggling idea. Secondly, they didn't describe their meetings as services, which also is a mind-boggling idea. It was to me. They also saw their meetings as gatherings and not really as formal ceremonial events like we tend to do. And all this comes from my doctoral dissertation, where I just got into this kind of thing in so much detail for 2.5 years that I really don't even want to talk about it anymore. But this stuff is so significant. Somebody's got to talk about this. Yeah. And also the third, fourth reason why they didn't call their early assemblies as worship services is because they were primarily horizontally focused with one another, as opposed to vertically focused as you're gathering together to do something for God. More I've thought about this, it seems that God's doing just fine without us doing much of anything. But what really needs work is one another. And that seems to be what the New Testament is talking about when it starts to discuss in some detail what we do when we get together. So tonight is the real meaning of worship in the Bible. And in order to do that, we got to talk about Greek words. Because if somebody asks me, what do I believe about worship? I have to ask this question. Well, which kind of worship are you talking about? Are you talking about proskuneo worship? Latruo worship? Latergeo worship? Sebomai worship? Or are you talking about threskeia worship? I know you don't know what those words mean, but that's what's really going on in the New Testament, because all 5 of these Greek words are translated as worship. And they all had unique, distinct meanings. None of them are synonymous. And yet when we throw the word worship at them, when English Bible translators throw the English word worship at them so that you read it in your Bible, it really gets confusing to us. When we hear the word worship, we immediately think of, well, that's what we do when we go to church. We're offering stuff up to God, singing, praying, with all the praise and worship music going on and worship bands. That's what we're thinking of. But interestingly enough, none of these words mean that. We're going to talk about some of the more significant words on this list. The question has to be asked to begin with, how do you determine what a Greek word means when it's found in the Bible? I mean, you can't just, there wasn't some Greek to English dictionary that somebody dug up from the first century so that you can always tell what these words mean. One reason why that didn't happen is because the language of English didn't exist in the first century. That makes the problem a little bit more harder, right? We're trying to translate an ancient Greek word into a very modern language with a different culture behind each one of them. So context determines meaning. From the guys who work with this kind of thing are called lexicologists. They work on lexicons, which are dictionaries. They determine how do you determine the meaning of words. One of my Greek professors in my doctoral program made a statement in class, and it just blew me away, and I hadn't forgotten it. And I always remember it when he's talking about this issue about what do Greek words mean today. He said, context determines meaning and nothing else. It's true in all languages, he said. Even if you're trying to figure out what a Japanese word means, a Swahili word, German, French, English, Hebrew or Greek, the context in which a word is found, in the sentence in which it is found, starts to give you clues as to what that word means, even in our own language. So, operating from this basic fundamental principle that context determines meaning, then we can start to look at all these Greek words, look at all the contexts in which they are found in the New Testament, and it's a lot of work. And then you can start to come to some good, solid conclusions. Now, it is true, there are things known as lexicons, Greek to English lexicons today. I have at least 6 of them in my library. One of them is 9 volumes long, Kittle's, maybe you have that one. I have another one that's 5 volumes long, it's thousands of pages. Somebody's done a lot of work to try to figure out what all these Greek words mean. But even those guys who wrote those books can be wrong. How is it possible that they could write 2,000 pages and be perfectly correct on all 2,000 pages with all 3,000 words or whatever it is they're defining? What I found out as I got deeper into this topic, especially with our first word, which is proskuneo, something's not right there. And I began to learn that the lexicons and the Greek experts and the English Bible translators have got these words wrong. And I know that's a big statement to make, but I hope to maybe actually prove some of that tonight. When you look at the word worship, the English word worship, as it is found in the New American Standard New Testament, I think they've got it like 70 times. It appears in the New Testament. 3/4 of the time, if you can see this part of the pie chart, it's the word proskuneo, which is what we're going to talk about first. All the others only make up 25% of the time that the word worship is found. So proskuneo becomes very important to our study. Here's another pie chart. When you look at all the times that proskuneo is found in the Greek New Testament, 87% of the time, your typical English translation has translated that word as worship. The other times, it's generally something like bow down. It seems like those are 2 different things, right? Bowing down and worshiping? What could they possibly have in common? To cut to the quick, I'm finding that is the real meaning of this word, and we'll talk about that in some detail. When you try to figure out what one of these words means in the New Testament, fortunately, we have an Old Testament. I guess it's true the Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew, but in the first century, the Bible that Jesus used, and Paul and Peter and John, was a Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. And so you have this big volume of an Old Testament, which actually has more books in it than the Protestant Bible does. It's more closer to the Catholic Bible in its canon. You had this massive volume of data, massive amount of times that these words are found, that you can go and look in the context of all those times in the Old Testament where the word is found in the Greek Old Testament, and begin to learn even more about these words. It's found 204 times in the Greek Old Testament and 61 times in the Greek New Testament. We're talking about the word proskuneo here. In the Old Testament, the question comes up then, if you find this word proskuneo 204 times in the Old Testament, what is the Hebrew word that the Septuagint translators translated into proskuneo. And it actually becomes a very useful study to figure this out, because every time it's this word, chava, hishtachava is how it would be pronounced in its usual form found in the Old Testament. Now, I apologize if I spit on you, Gary, there, but I said, that's how the Hebrew words go. So the question then becomes, well, what does that word mean? Chava. And interestingly enough, it means to bow down and prostrate yourself. If you look at like the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, which is just one of several, and I have several in my library as well. This was produced about 100 years ago. It's been updated by Holiday, and I have that one as well. And they all agree that it means this: 100% of the time, not 13%. 100% of the times when chava is found in the Old Testament, it means to prostrate yourself. Interesting. And they put it in 3 different settings. The first is bowing down or prostrating yourself in front of a monarch or somebody who is superior to you. I'm talking about prostration, getting down on your nose, basically. Also doing it before God. And you also find people doing this act of prostration before other gods. These 3 contexts. But for our purposes, the one that's the most important is when it appears before God. Because, well, all what we're concerned about, well, what then is worship to God? You know, we think of worship as something you do to God, right? So what is proskuneo to God mean? Well, I've looked up all the 204 times it's found in the New Testament with incredible detail. I should have been shot somewhere in the middle of that process, because it is. I stuck on this for several months, looking at all these times it was found, and it was mind-blowing. The issue of prostration raises the question, well, what is prostration? Now, if you can see this is an etching on an ancient carving. You can see a man down on hands and knees, bowing. He's prostrating. The word proskuneo is sometimes translated with a transliterated English word called proskinesis. He's performing proskinesis. I know we say he's worshiping, but what he's really doing is bowing down. He's prostrating himself. It was a common thing done, whether it's to a monarch, again, to God, or to other gods. This is what the word does. Now, in the Mishnah, which is rabbinical writings that actually span hundreds of years, this is one of the older statements in the Mishnah about hishtachava, which is hava, the Hebrew word. This particular rabbi, writing around 200 AD, said, hishtachava, this is prostrating oneself while spreading one's arms and legs in total submission. It's my best impression of a rabbi, I think. But it's getting down like this. So the Jews knew that they needed to define what this is, because it's absolutely required in the Old Testament. No question about it. And it's found, as I said, 204 times, and every time it means this, and people are doing it to God all the time. So it's important to even define, and the rabbis would get into great detail on exactly how this is done. Several hundred years later, here's another rabbi, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, also in the Mishnah. He says, prostrating, how is it done? They're starting to come on again. After he raises his head from the 5th bow, he sits on the ground and falls upon his face to the ground. The bowing referred to everywhere in the Bible, that is upon the knees. The Keda bow, however, is on the nose. Interesting. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that this is exactly what was going on in the Bible when you see this word, which you probably won't see this word, because what you're going to see most of the time is the word worship. But you can pretty much tell sometimes when you look up your Old Testament and New Testament, and you see the word worship, just see in your mind if prostration fits the context, and you'll find that it often does. So this is the gesture of prostration would change from culture to culture and from time to time. It would evolve through the years in the Middle East. We see some of this in popular culture today. This is a little dark of a photo, but there's Queen Elizabeth, and she's got somebody coming up before her, and he's, of course, on his knees, and he's before a monarch. So even though they're not trying to do biblical proskinesis, yet some elements of this ancient cultural gesture still exists today, even in the English-speaking world. Here's another photo. I don't know if you can see this very well. It's kind of dark, but this is Lady Gaga. And she's bowing before Queen Elizabeth. I think she thinks it's pretty funny in this case. But and you noticed just a couple of weeks ago, Queen Elizabeth died and Prince Charles becomes King Charles. And then people now who come up to him, they're bowing down. And when they leave the presence of the king, they're backing away, never turning your back to the monarch. Well, all this comes from this Middle Eastern cultural habit. And that is what proskuneo is. Now, there's also, in the movie Aladdin, I'm going to play just a little excerpt from it. Marilyn, just be ready. There's a speaker right in front of you. I hope this isn't too loud. You might remember this part of this song from Aladdin.
Yeah, that's loud.
Oh, you got to play it over again. Here we go.
Can you flex chocolate flex down on one knee? Now try your best to stay calm. Brush out your Sunday alarm. And don't me from
Okay, you get the idea. Great movie, by the way. I love it. What amazes me about these lyrics, they're using some language and some words that we don't use. Prince Ali, fabulously, Ali, blah, blah, genuflect. You may know what that is. I think it comes from bending your knee is what it literally means. Show some respect down on one knee. Now, of course, in the Bible times, they're going down on both knees. But try your best to stay calm. Brush up your Sunday salam. Now, we don't use this word, salam, but it's referring to prostration. Your Sunday salam is your prostration. Now, when this movie was remade with Will Smith as Aladdin just 3-4 years ago, they changed the lyrics on this because there is no such thing as a Sunday salam. He sings, brush up your Friday salam, because when Muslims go into the mosque, one thing they do is, of course, they salam, they proskynesis, they do prostration, but they do it on Friday, and nobody does it on Sunday. So this was sort of an anachronistic mistake made by the original writers of this song, which I don't need to get into more than that. But this is basically what you're talking about when you're talking about a prostration. That's an image I grabbed off the internet, and it's probably as close as I think was in existence in the first century in the Middle East in biblical culture. Here's another image. This is from, I think, possibly a Greek Orthodox church or some Orthodox church, where the people who are being ordained to the clergy are prostrated, full-blown prostration, hands out, legs out, nose to the ground. Have any of you ever seen this happen before? There's a couple of hands going up, yes. And it's a sign of great respect, great humility and submission, which biblical prostration did all of that as well. One more photo. This probably is something you more familiar, that's more familiar to you. These are Muslims performing prostration in a mosque. They're required to do this. Another finding I learned while doing this study was that the word mosque comes from the Arabic word masjid, which means a place of prostration. Now, we talk about having places of worship. They have a place of worship, but they know that worship actually means prostration. Now, I'm not saying that they've got it right, we've got it wrong. Everybody's got it wrong, so it's just a matter of degree, I guess. But this is prostration. So I think we're getting this fully in our head now, right? When I went through these 204 times that the word is found in the Old Testament, I noticed, and in the New Testament, I found several prostration indicators in the context of when this word proskuneo was found. So like in a sentence, if the word proskuneo is there, you look at the words that accompany it, and then you begin to get an idea of what the word itself, proskuneo, means. And here's some of them. First off, the word itself is something of an indication of prostration. Proskuneo. Pros is a common Greek prefix that means toward or to. When we have a lot of words that mean prefixes that carry some meaning to, like prefixes. Pre means before. So it's fixed before. Well, proskuneo means you do this to somebody or toward there's a very directional aspect to proskuneo. You'll see why here in a minute. Another prostration indicator is when the word appears with the word fall down. It's the Greek word pipto in the Greek. Often you see people falling down and worshiping is how it's translated, but they're falling down and prostrating. It's what they're doing. This Matthew 2:11, when the Magi, the three kings, come to see Jesus, the baby Jesus, they fall down and prostrate. Fall down and worship is how it's translated, but I think it's a bad translation. It's found 21 times, this combination of falling down and prostrating yourself in the Old Testament, and 12 times in the New Testament. That many times is mind-blowing to me. Here's another prostration indicator. People fall on their knees and do proskinesis. It's another indication, again, we're talking about prostration. Why do you have to be on your knees to worship? Well, you have to be on your knees to perform proskinesis. Another one, by the way, it's found 17 times in the Old Testament. Mark 15 also has that reference. Sometimes people fall on their face biblically. And then the word prostration appears again. Proskuneo appears then. Revelation is several times in Revelation, but 29 times in the Old Testament, 3 times in the New, people are falling on their face, and then this word is found. It's an indicator that it should not be translated as worship. It should be translated as prostrating yourself. I mean, you're on your face, you're on your knees, you're on the ground, which is actually, you fall on the ground. The ground is often mentioned in conjunction with the word prostration or proskuneo. Genesis 18:2 is a good example. That 33 times people are on the ground when they perform this act. Sometimes it says people fall at the feet of the person so honored. Now, that's not always before God. Sometimes it is, but sometimes at the feet of a king. And this is found 5 times in the Old Testament, 5 in the New. So sometimes also, and actually several times, the word come appears before prostrate. You come and worship is what we say, but what it means biblically, you come and you prostrate. The idea, it's found 43 times in the Old Testament. In order, you don't just drop down anywhere and perform prostration. You do it in front of the person or entity, deity, that you want to honor with the act. It is something done before them, which is the next thing. The word before often appears with prostration. You prostrate before the person you're doing this to. That's also found several times throughout Scripture. So when you see all these prostration indicators tossed in with the word proskuneo, you know it means worship. Ironically, your English Bibles don't translate it that way, even though I don't see any other way to translate it when you have this kind of evidence right in the context. How can you do that? You can think of some songs to come and worship. Isn't there some Christmas song, come and worship, worship Christ, the newborn King? Pardon my singing, but that is a biblical phrase, come and worship, but it's come and prostrate. You have to come into the presence of whether it's God in the temple or whatever, and you got to do that. Here's some examples, like from ones from just in the Old Testament, Genesis 42. You're familiar with the movie Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, Joseph's brothers came and prostrated to him, proskinesis, with their faces to the ground. So you get these prostration indicators of coming, and then their face is on the ground. I don't know how else you can translate this. They won't. The English Bibles will not translate this as worship because they don't want to have anybody worshiping some other humans. But when this word appears before God, they will always change it and say they're worshiping. This example in the New Testament, this is again is from the Magi, the 3 wise men who travel from afar to see the baby Jesus. After they came, here's the coming, into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down. And the translation is worshiped him, but they prostrated to him. The word to is also there in the Greek inherently, which you worshipped to Jesus or to him. No, they prostrated to him. They're on the ground. They're on their face. They've come to get in his presence to do this. It means prostration. as all the Hebrew lexicons know. This was a very interesting, when I found this reference, it blew me away. There's a guy named Herodotus, was a Greek from the 5th century BC, and he was traveling through Persia, modern day Iran. And he was writing of his experiences in seeing this other culture and how they do things. And he said, the Persians, if two Persians who are equal greet one another, they kiss each other on the lips. That's what you do if you're equal in that culture. If there's a slight difference in rank, the cheek is kissed. We see this in some cultures today as well. But if the difference in rank is great, says Herodotus, the person of lower stature falls down and prostrates himself. This is a good, helpful clue into the cultural aspect of proskynesis and prostration. It's a greeting. So I think that's my next point. Or was that my point at the top of it? Yes. Proskuneo is a greeting. It's the way either you greet people of greater stature, or it's the way you also greet God. It becomes important now to define if proskuneo appears in a temple context, does it mean worship or does it mean prostration? Well, here's an interesting passage from Ezekiel 46. This one also, when I found this, this was great. It helped me. The prince shall enter, this is sort of like coming, enter the temple by way of the porch of the gate from outside, and he stands by the post of the gate. Then he shall, now the translation in English is worship, but then he shall prostrate at the threshold of the gate and then go out. The people of the land shall also worship, no, prostrate at the doorway of that gate before the Lord, in the presence of the Lord, on the Sabbath and on the new moons, and they go out. What's going here is something of a traffic control situation. All these people were required to come to the temple and perform their obligatory prostration to God. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But when you have a long line of hundreds, if not thousands of people who need to perform their obligatory ritual prostration before God, you come in, there's the spot where you're down, then get up and get out. We got a bunch of people behind you, so don't waste time. Sometimes you may see on TV where Muslims are going to Mecca, and there's these massive crowds of people. You got to control what's going on and get them moving. Well, here, this is what's going on in Ezekiel 46. So it's a temple greeting. Once they, let me back up to this thing again. He says, well, they're the gate. They're coming in through the gate that makes you officially enter the temple. Once you're on the temple grounds, then you're in the presence of God. And the only thing you can do is to prostrate yourself. It's the proper way to greet your God, to appear before him. Here's another passage, 2 Kings 19. This was interesting. As Sennacherib was prostrating, again, your translation and your Bible would say worshiping, in the house of Nisroch, his God, Adrammelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword. Understanding that the Hebrews reading this, they would have understood that when Sennacherib was prostrating, he's got his face down. I mean, he's a target, right? He's easy kill at this point. When he's down like this, that's when Adrammelech and Sharezer take care of him, take him out. So another point about this verse is this shows you how this is also being done in pagan temples as well, not just in the Jerusalem temple, the temple of the Jews. This was throughout the Middle Eastern culture. No matter who your god was, whether it's Zeus or Athena or you name your god, they would have temples. And there were temples in all these cities back then. And what you do when you go into the temple, no matter who the god is, down you go. That was a common cultural thing done at this time. Here's another passage. This is in Revelation. This is the New Testament, where the angel says to John, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Now, this is how it's translated in most Bibles. Those who worship in it. And then a little later on, it says the 24 elders who sit on the thrones before God fell on their faces and prostrated to God. Now, this word here in the Greek is identical to this word here. So why would you switch? They're definitely on their faces. They're definitely falling down, and they're doing it to God, and they're in the temple. There's just no other way to translate this than to say measure the temple of God, and those who prostrate in it. When you understand prostration is this very significant religious act. Here's another one. This is in the New Testament. This is actually in 1 Corinthians 14 that we talked about last week. This is the one passage in the New Testament that has the most information about what Christians ought to be doing in their assemblies. But Paul, in this passage, he raises the hypothetical situation of an outsider who comes into a Christian assembly. And he says, if all the Christians are prophesying and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all because he understands what they're saying. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed. And so, falling on his face, he will, your translation says, worship God, declare that God is really among you. Notice again all these prostration indicators here. He's falling. He's on his face. And he's doing it because he thinks God is there. And if God is there, the only way to respond to that is down you go. You get it? The argument going on here in 1 Corinthians 14, he's talking about the inappropriateness of speaking in tongues without tongues being interpreted. Because if the outsider comes in and sees a bunch of people speaking in another language and nobody's translating this, he's going to say, you are all crazy. But prophecy, which is speaking to people so they understand it and they're actually helping people, that's how they get convicted, and that's how this reaction happens by this outsider. So interestingly enough, in this situation, it's not Christians who worship, if you want to use that word. Christians don't, but it's the outsider who prostrates to God when he sees a very meaningful assembly taking place. To interpret that a little bit for you. So to summarize some of this, biblical proskuneo worship is this. It's a physical act. It's not an emotion. You look at all 204 times in the Old Testament and all 61 in the New Testament, it's not talking about an emotion, but we tend to think about, well, I was worshiping God and I had my eyes closed and I had my hand raised. So, and if I really squint really hard, then I can rather conjure up even some more worship than I had just a few seconds ago. It's though it's this internal thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to manufacture it. But biblically, proskunesis is a very physical, observable act. It's actually a type of greeting. It's never identified in the New Testament as a Christian act, something that Christians do. There's this interesting verse in Revelation 19:10 and also in the last chapter, 22:9. John, an angel comes up to the Apostle John, and John sees this angel. What does he do? Down he goes. And the angel said, you must not do that. You prostrate only to God. As it's translated in our Bibles, worship God. But it's not saying worship God, it's saying prostrate. God is the only one to whom that act should be given. And there's, seems like I had a whole bunch more on this. Maybe it's coming up later. This is one passage where you may have heard the word worship used in reference to what Christians ought to be doing. This is John chapter 4. Jesus is having this discussion with the Samaritan woman at the well, and she sees, they both can see the Samaritan temple right in the distance up on Mount Gerizim, and she throws a question at Jesus once she realizes that this guy knows something. She says, you Jews, you worship, no, you prostrate in Jerusalem, while we Samaritans do it in Mount Gerizim. Which is right? Well, Jesus says the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, the word worship is throughout that passage. But why do we think that this is talking about a Christian assembly? There's nothing in the context. There's Jesus standing at a well in Samaria, and they're looking up at Mount Gerizim. They're comparing temples, the Jerusalem one and the Samaritan one. Why do we think that this is talking about Christian gatherings? As I ask here, there's no reason to assume that John 4 is talking about Christian assemblies. And to go back to this verse again, since this is talking about temple proskuneo, every other time in the Old and New Testament where it talks about proskuneo in a temple, it's talking about prostration. And so I got to think that in this passage, in John chapter 4, they're talking about prostration again, even in that passage. The word worship rolls off the tongue so well there to us. And I don't know if you've probably heard, how many of you heard this verse before? Worship in spirit and truth. I think all of you know it so well you don't even raise your hand. It's just that common. But what really is it talking about? I think what Jesus is talking about here is the same thing he was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. What's really important with all the things you do it with the heart and not just with rote obedience and just not even thinking about it. If somebody strikes you on the cheek, you turn to them the other one. If somebody forces you to go 1 mile, you go 2. You go overboard. It's what's in the heart is what's important, and that's what I think he is saying in this passage. By prostrating it with your spirit and truly doing it, that's spirit and truth, I think. So let's summarize this proskuneo business here, and it basically is summarized with these few words. It means to prostrate to, and it works in all 204 cases in the Old Testament and all 61 cases in the New Testament. You got 275 cases in your Bible, and it works. It fits. It's consistent with the context. It's consistent with the Hebrew word hava. And yet, somewhere along the line, our English Bibles have gone astray. Let's talk about a second word now. Maybe I should hold off there. Questions? Questions about proskuneo? Yeah, Gary.
Would this mean that we would not look directly at our God? That we wouldn't be face to face, eye to eye?
Interesting question. I don't recall any time in all those times in the Old and New Testament where they had to look away and couldn't look him in the eye, but maybe that was the case a couple of times. I don't know.
Well, like Moses had to be in the crevice of the rock when he passed by.
Yes. Maybe that's true. The only illustration I can think of is from the movie Anchorman, where Will Ferrell tells his kid, "Do not look me in the eye. Head, eyes down, eyes down." So the kids have to walk around like this all the time. They're not allowed to look at their father in the face, which is kind of what you're talking about. It's the same dynamic. But a hint on this. Revelation talks about proskuneo in heaven and in this eschatological vision of Revelation. Yes, the true followers of God are the ones who prostrate to God in the vision in Revelation. They perform prostration. They're falling on their faces. I'm just guessing here, when you get to heaven and you come face to face with God or Jesus, my suggestion is get down really fast. Because this is the biblical cultural gesture. Now, how loose God's going to be on that whole thing, I don't know. Whether you got to be on your nose, you're not on your nose. Out you go to hell. I just don't know that's going to happen. But yeah. Anyway, so let's go to the next one. And I know that's a lot of Greek. We got some more Greek here. This one gets just a little more complicated. Latruo is this word. The noun form is latreia. It is found 107 times in the Greek Old Testament, 26 times in the Greek New Testament. And of all the times that the word worship is found in the New Testament, only 9% of the time did the NASB translators translate or use the word worship as a translation of latruo. When you see latruo in the New Testament, only 23% of all the times it's found is it translated as worship. At least in typical English Bibles, it'll vary from one translation to the next, NIV or ESV, KJV, whatever. Most of the time, latruo or latreia is translated as serve or service. Well, when I got into the weeds on this and started studying all, 200 cases of this word in the Old Testament, I found that it comes from this Hebrew word, abad. And this word is a normal word for simply to serve. And it's used in a variety of different contexts. And when the Septuagint translators translated this word into Greek, they didn't use just one word to translate it. They used several. So it has different meanings depending on the different contexts in which it is found. Latruo is one of them. Here's douluo. You may have heard of a doula. Is that somebody who helps a woman with pregnant or give birth? A doula? Is that right? Someone nod for me. I've never given birth, to my knowledge. I'm not used to that. But it means to serve as a slave. Later geo is to do priestly service. Again, service is a key concept here, but it's priestly. Ergatsomai is the word for work. Poieo, the word for to do or to make. All these different Greek words are used to translate abad in the Greek Old Testament, which makes it interesting. Makes it a little more complicated figuring out what this word means. But you start to study all the times that it is found, it means this. It doesn't mean just to serve, because, I could serve you cookies. And my wife's thumbprints are back there. They're really good tonight. I could serve you cookies, but is that latruo? No, it's not. I could serve a pitch at a baseball game. The serve is used in a serve in tennis. This is not latruo. It means to serve deity. When this Greek or Hebrew word abad is found in the context of something done for God, that's when they translated it as latruo, service to God, but it's more specific than that, to serve him with sacrifice. This is probably a terrible illustration, but it's one thing I found on the internet where, the sacrifices were this is what was done in the temple. This was done in all temples of all religions back then. They would bring the fatted calf or brings a pigeon or whatever they bring, and they throw it on the altar and they burn it. That was the job of the priests. And this whole act of serving the deity, whether it's a pagan god or the god, with sacrifice, that is latruo. That was pretty fascinating to learn that. And here's a quick illustration about how, when it's first found in the Old Testament, in the Exodus story. The Hebrews are in Egypt, and they're working as slaves for Pharaoh. This is all from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But Moses comes before Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Well, he wants to go to worship their God. And this is what he says to Pharaoh. The reason they want to let my people go is so that they might worship their God. But it is the Greek word latruo. Okay, so what does that mean? When they wanted to go worship their God at this mountain, what are you talking about? Well, they set up in pews, and then they would have 3 songs and a prayer and pass a collection plate, and none of that. It's so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And repeatedly throughout Exodus, in this story, it talks about latruo, meaning to sacrifice. There's one point in the story where Moses says to Pharaoh, "I got to take my herds and my flocks with us, my flocks of sheep and my herds of cattle." And Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not letting you take your cattle." And Moses comes back and says, "How can we worship God without our cattle?" Well, you need the cattle because you got to offer sacrifice. And you're going to offer the fatted calf and burn it on the altar, and several of them, more than likely. And then here goes the sheep, and get the pigeons out, and that's just going to roast them big time. That's what happens. But finally, Pharaoh gives in to Moses and says, "Okay, take your cattle, I don't care." But not too many of us today think that in order for us to worship God on Sunday, we got to have our cattle with us. See, something's wrong with the word worship as it's found in the Bible. The translation is wrong. I want to compare latruo to latergeo, which is the third word, but this is a good time to look at this because both of these terms were used to translate that Hebrew word abad, which means to serve. But these have 2 specific meanings. They're both similar in that they both mean service to deity. When you perform latruo, you're definitely doing something for God. You are definitely doing something in a temple, whether it's to a pagan god or to the God of Israel. But here's where they change. Latruo is an act done by non-priests, and latergeo is what the priests do. When they're up there working with the sacrifices, preparing them, getting out the showbread, making sure the candle is lit, and all the stuff inside the holy place and the most holy place, all the stuff that they do there is latergeo. But what happens outside that holy place where anybody goes, that's something the non-priests do. That's the latruo service. That's offering sacrifice. But these guys, when they're performing latergeo, they're performing any priestly duty there in the temple. So just to translate what they did as to serve doesn't really say what's going on. And I could mount up a whole bunch of verses that actually prove this case. This is not really it's not really hard to prove. But again, the translations today don't reflect that. This was a big revelation for me as I went through all these passages. I found that there are two basic fundamental religious obligations to every Jew in the Old Testament. And it refers to these two words, proskuneo, prostration, and latruo, offering sacrifice. The two fundamental religious obligations of every Jew. And it comes from Deuteronomy 16:16. It's actually repeated several times in the Pentateuch. 3 times in a year. This is God speaking, by the way. 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, which is the temple, at the feast of unleavened bread, and at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Now, interestingly enough, proskuneo is not found in this verse. Neither is latruo. But the concept is there. Appearing before the Lord. Remember, the word before is one of those indicators of prostration. And they're not to come empty-handed. They're supposed to bring a sacrifice. This, to begin to get your head oriented to understand the Old Testament on the basis of Deuteronomy 16:16 is a very enlightening thing. These are the two fundamental duties of every male Jew. They had to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, at these 3 feasts and perform those 2 things. Appear before the Lord, just like that prince in Ezekiel 46. Down you go. Down you go, and then you get up and get out. But then you also offer your sacrifice. And you remember in the Gospels, when Jesus, the so-called cleansing of the temple, where Jesus gets upset with the guys who are buying and selling in the temple. They're selling pigeons, they're selling sacrifices so that the people who have traveled from far off, they're not coming empty-handed. And so when they finally go into the temple to offer this to the priest and get it offered on the altar, they're be able to fulfill both these obligations of every Jew. Here's another passage. The second commandment of the 10 commandments says, you shall not. Now, let me translate the way your Bible says. You shall not worship or serve other gods. But it's our 2 words, proskuneo and latruo. You shall not prostrate to other gods, and you shall not serve them with sacrifices. And to do either of those things to another god is really bad. That's a serious no-no. The kinds of punishments for doing that listed in the entire Old Testament are astonishing. And you can have several generations of your family paying punishment for that offense. That's the big one. It's the second commandment. Deuteronomy 8:19, this is where that's sort of expressed. If you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and sacrifice to them and prostrate to them, that's proskuneo there, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. Those 2 things. And was that on the last verse? I guess maybe it's the next verse. I list down here. Here's all the other passages that list these 2 things. Worship and serve with sacrifice together. Prostrate and offer sacrifice. Jesus himself cites this idea in Matthew 4. This is the temptation by Satan in the desert, in the wilderness. And Satan says, if you will worship me, but if you'll bow down to me, it's prostrate again, it's proskinesis. Jesus' response says, you shall prostrate to the Lord your God, and to him alone you shall sacrifice. Now again, your translations will say, you shall worship the Lord your God, and to him alone you shall serve. It's much more specific than that in both cases, in Matthew 4 and verse 10, and also in Luke chapter 4 when the same thing is recorded, or in all these other verses. And it's a long list of them. It's just remarkable how these 2 things, how these 2 fundamental religious obligations of every Jew, I didn't say Christian. Things change with Jesus. Okay, coming back to the Matthew 2:11. This is the story again of the three wise men coming to see the baby Jesus. After they came into the house, saw the child with his mother Mary, they fell down and prostrated. We know that. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know the story. You sing it every Christmas. But they're doing the two things: prostrating, then offering. They didn't come empty-handed, but they offer a sacrifice or an offering to Jesus. Sacrifices and offerings kind of fall into the same category. So even in this day, I think to some way our culture does this in a much briefer version. If you're to go over to somebody's house who's hosting you for dinner, you greet them at the door in the customary way, maybe with a handshake, maybe with a hug, maybe with a kiss, depending on the relationship that you have. And then it's customary to not come empty-handed, you know. I have a bottle of wine. I got my wife's thumbprints. I brought them tonight, so whatever it is. But this general cultural thing has been going on around the planet for thousands of years. But in the Bible, it's actual prostration when it's before somebody that's greater than you or before God, and it's an actual sacrifice. But there's more to it. The New Testament introduces a new use of this word latruo, and it's a metaphorical use of serving with sacrifice. Okay? And you're familiar, back up, with this verse, Romans 12:1, which is often cited. Paul says he's coming to this big conclusion of his long argument in the book. He says, therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual latreia. That's the Greek word there. Now, your translations will probably say worship there. And then that's going to make us all think about what we do in church. But look at the context. It's talking about presenting, which is what you do with a sacrifice. You present it, you offer it. Sometimes that is translated as offer. It actually uses the word sacrifice and a holy sacrifice. This was also a concept from the Old Testament. Sacrifices needed to be holy and they needed to be acceptable to God. All this language is sacrificial language, and this is your spiritual worship. Now, Paul can't say this is your latreia because it's a metaphorical latreia. We don't serve God with sacrifices today. I haven't brought a dead cow to church in a long time. But it's a spiritual thing. There's a few other verses to look at here. This one, in Hebrews chapter 13. At the end of chapter 12, the writer uses the word latreia, interestingly enough, and he uses it in a metaphorical sense. And then beginning with 13:1 through this verse, he starts to identify what that is, what spiritual or metaphorical serving with sacrifice entails. And he says here at the end, he says, through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that give thanks to his name. Do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. So Christians are to perform latreia, but it's not literal latreia of, again, offering up a dead sheep, but a spiritual sacrifice, offering your bodies, of sacrifice of praise, of doing good and sharing. Nothing that's exclusively something that happens inside your assemblies, but even outside as well. With such sacrifices, God is well pleased. So let's summarize latruo. It means to serve with sacrifice. But again, there's a few times in the New Testament where it means it metaphorically, and you can tell it means it not with a literal sacrifice, but with a metaphorical or a spiritual one. Now, word number 3, what time is it? Is it? It's like 7:27. Is that what it is? Okay. Almost done. This goes really quick. And I'm not going to do the 4th and the 5th one because this is way too. I'm amazed you're still awake. You guys are nuts. Latergetho. This is where it's found 150 times in the Old Testament, and only 15 in the New. But the interesting thing about of these 165 occurrences, it's translated as worship only once. And that's in Acts chapter 13 and verse 2. Now, this statement needs to be qualified. There are some translations that don't ever translate it as worship. And there's some that might translate it as worship 2 or 3 times. But generally, it's just one time. But it all comes around Acts chapter 13 and verse 2. When I first preached some of these conclusions back in 1977. And I made the statement that the Bible never says that we worship in church, that the purpose of gathering is to worship. A dear Christian woman in the church came up to me and said, Tom, the Bible does say we worship in church. And she brought out Acts chapter 13 and verse 2, which says this. Now there were prophets and teachers at Antioch in the church that was there. There was Barnabas and Simeon and Lucius and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod, and there was Saul. Now while they were, the translation she was using, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart Barnabas and Saul for me to the work which I called them. And then we had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them. They sent them out. Again, this translation is the NASB of 2020. I don't know if you know, but the New American Standard Version first came out in 1963. It was updated around 1995. They just came out with a new update to that, even still, is in 2020. And NASB tends to be more literal than the other translations that are out there. But they did away with translating this as worship. They realized there's some problems there with doing that. They were serving the Lord. But even serving is not quite right, because this term, wherever it is found in the Old Testament, talks about performing priestly service. You remember the difference between latruo, this is when non-priests offer sacrifice in a temple. Latergeo is when priests do their work inside the temple. That is latergeo. What's going on here, back up to this verse? What does this word mean? Well, it is kind of mind-boggling that Luke would use latergeo right here. What is he doing? Because every one of his readers would have been familiar with Jewish culture. Luke was intensely familiar with it. When he says, while they were serving like a priest to the Lord, and they were fasting, the Holy Spirit said this stuff. He is essentially elevating the work of these 5 prophets and teachers at Antioch and saying they're basically the same as the priests of old of the temple. And he's elevating the distinctiveness and the stature of their work of prophecy and teaching. And he describes it with this metaphorical use of the word latergeo. I don't know if what I said is clear to you, but I'm going to move on. And feel free to disagree, but nobody really would disagree with me on this, of scholars who understand that, because this is the only time out of 165 times in the Bible it's translated as worship. And does it mean what we mean when we talk about, getting into the pews and doing what we do in church? Don't think so. Matter of fact, I know so. It does not. So a summary, it means to perform priestly service. So what's the real meaning of these terms? Proskuneo means to prostrate to. Latruo means to serve with sacrifice. Latergeo means to perform priestly ministry. Sebomai, which we didn't get to, and you can thank me later, means to revere. And threskeia, which is only translated as once as worship in some translations, actually means religion. I don't know. I'm going to force myself not to talk about those because somebody will have to kill me because it's terribly boring. But you did well putting up with all this tonight. So to recap, these first points that we started with tonight, that we ended last night with, why didn't they have worship services in the early church? They didn't describe their meetings as worship. They didn't describe their meetings as services. They called their meetings gatherings, and their meetings were horizontally focused. They didn't use these worship words because they just simply didn't apply. When Christians got together, when they walked in the door of somebody's house, remember these are house churches, they didn't all drop down and perform prostration. There's no indication that that happens. There's actually in second century literature, one Christian writer who says, we don't do that. Our people don't do that. That's a pagan thing that is done. Pagans do that. We don't do that. He makes a sermon out of this thing. We keep our eyes upward. We don't look down to where the demons live. That's what this writer says in the second century. Obviously getting carried away with his sermonizing there. So that's what's going on there. That's what we're talking about, the assembly, and how we got worship wrong. Now, I suspect you have some questions and comments and maybe some objections. I'm all ears.